Welcome to Undertold Verbatim. I'm Solveig Rennan for the Undertold Stories Project. We report from all over the world for PBS NewsHour on the consequences of poverty and the work of change agents addressing them. We've done extended interviews with hundreds of experts and people making a difference in their communities. In this podcast, we're revisiting those undertold stories so you can hear changemakers around the world in their own words. This is Undertold Verbatim. First a state senator, then governor of Georgia, Jimmy Carter served as president of the United States from 1977 to 1981. His single term was marked by inflation, economic recession, and the Iran hostage crisis. But there was a high point that endures to this day.
We are privileged to witness tonight a significant achievement in the cause of peace.
The Camp David peace accords he brokered that brought peace between Egypt and Israel.
A framework for peace in the Middle East.
After Carter left office in 1981, he dove into humanitarian work with his own non-governmental organization. He's worked to eradicate neglected tropical diseases and mediate age-old conflicts around the world, including Sudan and South Sudan, two nations carved out of one after a bitter war that Carter helped end.
We've been working on several issues, and we've been dealing with diseases that afflict both the Sudanese in the north and southern part.
Good morning, Mr. President.
That's where our director, Fred DeSam Lazaro, met with President Carter in 2010 and again in 2011. It was not just political hostility that festered at the time. So did a dreadful disease, dracunculiasis, better known as guinea worm.
So guinea worm is a major challenge for us. It's one of the most ancient diseases. It's known in the Bible as the fiery serpent.
The waterborne parasite grows up to 3 feet and lives just below the skin, often crippling its human host. There are no vaccines or medicines to treat it. The only cure is to slowly, painfully extract it over days. Once a widespread threat, many countries have beaten guinea worm, but eradication remained elusive in Sudan and South Sudan.
We reduced the incidence from more than 2.5 million cases down to about 2,500 cases in the whole world, and the last major holdout will be here in southern Sudan. So we're very excited about the prospect of a final total eradication of this disease from the face of the earth.
We've been hearing a lot of news reports lately about the unsettled conditions in the South and escalation in violence for a variety of reasons, and I'm just wondering how much you sense that's hindering the guinea worm campaign in its final stretch.
Nearly a decade later, the violence, at the time part of the struggle for independence in the South, has never abated as rival factions of leadership battle for power in the newly independent South Sudan. So, the guinea worm campaign remains in that final stretch. Still, the former president credits the Carter Center's approach for moving the effort this close to the finish line.
The Carter Center is deeply immersed in the life of the people in the most remote villages of Sudan and other nations in which we've been involved. And I think we have built up a trust in us to do the right thing for the people, and that's given us confidence that we'll be successful here.
Despite his high profile, President Carter made a habit early on to leave his home in Plains, Georgia, and get his own boots on the ground.
What do you expect you can impact by actually being here that you couldn't? He's sitting in Plains and being on the telephone.
Well, when I come as a former president, I don't have any trouble having a direct conversation with the president of Sudan. So I think that personal involvement of myself has been not only helpful in the overall success of our programs, but highly gratifying to me personally. It's one of the finest aspects of my life to actually go to a village like we will tomorrow, to know that they prepared for my coming. They're very eager to show me the best side of their lives, They are very eager to tell me what their problems are that remain and to describe the progress that they've made. So it's not only gratifying to me, but also for the villages themselves. And of course, the cumulative effect of all those villages works its way up to the president of a nation or the vice president of a country.
The Carter Center is 38 years old now. That means President Carter has done this foreign aid and diplomacy work almost 10 times as long as he held the job of Commander-in-Chief.
Mr. President, if you were to extrapolate from your experience in healthcare, in eradication programs like guinea worm, etc., to the larger modus operandi of the donor aid activities in general, what would you say have been the keys to the success of the Carter Center, certainly in guinea worm, that might be useful elements to incorporate in the larger sort of donor effort to eradicate poverty and disease?
Well, I'm a little bit biased about this. When I was president of the United States, the USAID program, for instance, was conducted by professionals who worked for the government. And some of my successors have changed that dramatically, so that most of the actual funds expended and the efforts made are by contractors who quite often have not been competent or deeply dedicated to achieving the avowed goal. I think that the hunger of people, particularly in Africa and other places where poverty is a blight, for good health is quite often underestimated, and their intelligence, their ability to deal with their own problems is underestimated. We work with villagers who quite often have never seen a textbook, never have known what even the word literacy means. And we have found that they're just as intelligent, just as hardworking, just as dedicated. They love their children just as much as I do. And we tend to underestimate the quality of the people who suffer from causes beyond their comprehension or grasp. So the more that the rich countries on earth can deal generously and persistently and intimately with the people in the suffering communities on earth, the better off the whole world will be. And I've been very grateful that the Carter Center has been able not only to raise funds, but we actually go into the villages, into the homes of people, and work directly with those who are afflicted. And I think that personal relationship needs to be emphasized as funds and medicines and other supplies are allocated by governments themselves.
There are people who would say that billions have been poured into aid without the payoff that one needs. Is that the key, basically, that personal on-the-ground relationship? Is it an accountability issue? To whom should the effort be accountable? To the poor people? To the governments? What works for you?
Well, I'm biased about it because, you know, I see the extremely high efficiency of what the Carter Center does with limited funds. But we're actually in the villages. You know, we work with the village chiefs and with the people who have a particular affliction. And when we have funds, we make sure that every dollar is spent wisely and effectively. But the more interruptions you have between the allocation of funds and the ultimate expenditure, the more waste there is and the more impersonal the relationship is. The workers for the Carter Center are just almost part of the families of the people who still suffer from guinea worm and onchocerciasis and other diseases that we deal with here in the South. So I think that that needs to be re-emphasized. There has been a much more impersonal channel of delivery of humanitarian services between the major donors, that is major governments and international institutions, and the people who are in need. And I think that's one of the bridges that the Carter Center has never permitted to arise. We raise the funds from private donors almost exclusively, and we actually put the food or the medicine into people's mouths and teach them how to use a filter cloth, and we monitor the results of our work. So that's a difference. I'm not criticizing other people because I know Everyone can't be like the Carter Center, but I think that has been a trend in our federal government agencies in the past years, where we used to have most of the actual workers who delivered services being part of the U.S. government. Now it's private contractors, and sometimes we see that those private contractors don't have the well-being of the people nearly as much in their hearts and minds as they do the allocation of funds that comes to them.
You've talked a lot about how key it's been to get the confidence of the people being served. How did your workers, how did the Carter Center achieve that? How do you gain people's confidence for a campaign like this?
It's not easy, because guinea worm is a biblical disease. It's been in effect more than 10,000 years in many other countries, in addition to the ones where we have worked. And the people had gotten accustomed to guinea worm as an unavoidable and persistent and never-ending disease. And when we went into the first villages and through interpreters talked to the chiefs of the village or the witch doctors and so forth, they would tell us that it was caused by the drinking of goat's blood, or it was caused by the confluence of planets, or a special curse of God on that village, or the sins of their ancestors. They had no idea that it came from their pond of water. In fact, the ponds of water were looked upon as sacred. If that particular rain-filled pond hadn't been there, the village wouldn't have existed. They wouldn't be alive. So, in a way, what we told them about guinea worm was, to them, sacrilegious. It violated their religious beliefs. And it was only by inducing them to try our technique for a year that we were able to get them to comply. And of course we said that the curse was on, that the pond was in effect sacred, but there was a curse on that pond, and that was the guinea worm eggs that existed in it. And if they would just help us remove those guinea worm eggs from their pond, or from the drink of water that they took out of the pond, then that curse could be removed from their pond and their village forever. So we had, you might say, not only a philosophical but also a theological explanation to make. And there was another problem that we had in a number of villages, and that was that the witch doctors made their livelihood from treating guinea worm. And you can't cure a guinea worm, but you have to treat it during the painful 30 days or so that the guinea worm is emerging. And the witch doctors didn't want to see, in fact, the guinea worm disease eradicated, because it did away with a lot of our potential income. So we had all those problems to address. And I believe I mentioned earlier that we had 23,600 villages in which we found guinea worm once we started. And we had that kind of problem to overcome in almost every village.
Carter is no stranger to theological explanations. He spoke openly about his Christian faith on the presidential campaign trail, one of the first candidates to do so.
What about the role of your faith? How much of that is a driver in your work? And another part of that question, sir, is the enormous faith and piety that one sees amid so much suffering in these countries. Does that impress you as well?
Well, it does. My religious faith has been a driving force in my life ever since I was a little child. I've been teaching Bible lessons since I was 18 years old. I still teach every Sunday. Then I'm home in Plains, an average of about 35 times a year. And this is provides me with self-assurance that God cares about me and other people. And it also performs I'd say a standard of ethical or moral commitments that I try to observe. I'm not bragging on myself, but I'm trying to answer your question. When I was President of the United States, I tried to implement the teachings I had learned as a religious person. I worshiped the Prince of Peace. I tried to preserve the peace. We never launched a missile or fired a bullet or dropped a bomb while I was president. And still we protected the interests of my country. And I would say that my religion is still a vibrant part of my life, very pleasant, challenging, and one that I presume I'll have the rest of my days.
Our interviews with President Carter were originally featured on the PBS program Religion and Ethics News Weekly, in the stories Carter versus Guinea Worm in 2010 and A New State, South Sudan in 2011. To see how the guinea worm is extracted from a human host, or learn more about the referendum for independence, go to undertoldstories.org. Coming up, in our next few episodes, we'll learn about Chef Sean Sherman's movement to revitalize Native American cooking.
You know, like around here, you can't get more Minnesotan than those foods because they've been here longer than Minnesota was a concept.
And the lethal legacy that landmines leave behind.
If an area is contaminated by landmines, sometimes they just don't have a choice other than to enter that minefield in order to make a living.
You can find every Undertold Verbatim episode, virtual reality 360 experiences, and our entire library of Undertold news reports from around the world at undertoldstories.org. This episode was hosted by me, Solveig Rennan, and produced and edited by Simeon Lancaster. The interviews were conducted by our director, Fred DeSam Lazaro. Undertold Verbatim is brought to you by the Undertold Stories Project at the University of St. Thomas in Minnesota. As always, thanks for your support.